I never thought a Tuesday morning could feel like a punch to the chest, but there I was, staring at her across the cluttered counter of the bookstore where I worked part-time. My hands were full of returned novels, but it wasn't the weight of paper that had my chest tight. It was her. She was leaning over the counter, examining a leather-bound notebook as if it held the answers to some secret she hadn't yet allowed the world to see. Her hair had that soft silver sheen at the edges, the kind that caught the sunlight and made you forget everything else. She looked confident, almost untouchable, but there was a tiny crease between her brows, just enough to hint at her human side. "Did you check the spine?" she asked, her voice calm but precise, like every word had been weighed before it left her lips. I fumbled with the stack of books, embarrassed by the sudden heat in my face. I did. I thought I did." She raised one brow, slow, deliberate. "Then why does it feel so wrong?" I blinked, because the question wasn't about the notebook. Or maybe it was, and I was just too dense to see it. My stomach twisted in that familiar way whenever she looked at me like that, like she could see through the walls I tried so hard to build. I wanted to answer something clever, something that would make her smile, but all I managed was a crooked grin. "Then why does it feel so right?" She paused, just a fraction of a second, but long enough for the silence to hum between us. And in that pause, something shifted, electric, unspoken, suspended in the air like dust motes in the late morning sun streaming through the front window. I caught her eyes, green flecks and calm authority, and noticed how her hand lingered on the notebook a second longer than necessary. My brain short-circuited, trying to process 1,000 possibilities in the span of a heartbeat. She laughed softly, not at me, not cruelly, but with that quiet warmth that made the world shrink down to just the two of us. "I think," she said finally, leaning back just enough to meet my gaze fully, "you're enjoying breaking the rules more than you admit." My chest tightened again, not from guilt, not exactly, but from the thrill of being caught in a way that felt intimate, even if we'd never spoken beyond the polite exchanges of clerk and customer. I wanted to tell her something, anything, but the words lodged in my throat, leaving only that jittery awareness that I had noticed everything about her. The slight tilt of her head, the way she touched the edge of the notebook, the faint perfume that was floral without being cloying. Then she did something small, so small I almost missed it. She slid the notebook across the counter toward me. A gesture meant for convenience, maybe, but the weight of it lingered on my fingertips longer than it should have. I felt her warmth brush against me in that microsecond, and I hated and loved the way it made my heart beat louder. "Thanks," I muttered, not trusting my voice to do more. Her smile was slight, enigmatic, confident. She turned, and the bookstore felt suddenly emptier, quieter, like it had been holding its breath. I watched her walk away, the sound of her heels soft on the wooden floor, and I realized I couldn't stop thinking about that pause, that glance, that impossible little spark. Even now, hours later, as I stack books and pretend to concentrate, it's that exact moment I replay in my head, the one where everything felt wrong and yet, undeniably, so right. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. I told myself that as I followed her into the small back room of the bookstore, where the stock was stacked haphazardly, and dust motes hung in the sun like tiny floating lanterns. She'd asked for help carrying a box of returned books down from the top shelf, and I had jumped at the excuse to be near her again. She moved with a deliberate grace, but there was something in the way her shoulders tensed that I couldn't ignore. Her jaw was tight, and she avoided looking at me directly, scanning the shelves as if she were seeing them for the first time. I noticed the way her fingers lingered over the spines, brushing dust away more gently than necessary, and I realized she hadn't noticed I was watching. "Careful," she muttered without looking up. Her voice was quieter this time, almost vulnerable, as if she wasn't used to needing help. I stepped closer, balancing the box between us. "I've got it. Don't strain yourself." My words sounded too casual even to me, but I couldn't stop my eyes from tracing the line of her neck, the curve of her wrist as she adjusted the box. She let out a soft sigh, almost inaudible, and I felt the air shift. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the sudden fragility in her stance, the subtle tremor in her fingers as she reached for the next book. She didn't ask for help again, but she let me move a few steps closer, letting me steady the box while she balanced the weight on her own. I wanted to say something clever, something that would break the tension without sounding like I was trying too hard. Instead, I just watched, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly when she concentrated, the quiet determination in her movements. Every tiny detail felt loaded, heavy with an unspoken honesty that both terrified and fascinated me. At one point, the box slipped a little, and she caught it instinctively, her fingers brushing mine. It was brief, fleeting, but enough to send a jolt through me. She didn't comment, didn't even look at me, but I saw the subtle pause in her breathing, the almost imperceptible shake in her hand. "You're stronger than you let on," I said softly, more a statement than a question. Her eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second before darting back to the shelf. "I manage," she replied, voice careful, controlled, but the hesitation at the end betrayed her. We finished stacking the boxes in silence, the kind that hums with everything neither of us is saying. Then, as I turned to leave, she lingered just a second longer than necessary near the counter, and our hands brushed again, slightly longer this time. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she gave me a small, almost shy smile, one that seemed to carry a quiet admission that maybe, just for a moment, she didn't mind me being close. And I realized, as I walked back into the main store, that the smallest gestures, her sigh, her hesitant smile, the tilt of her hand, were enough to make my chest feel impossibly full. That brief, charged contact had planted something I couldn't stop thinking about, a pull I knew was dangerous, forbidden, and entirely irresistible. The rain had started quietly at first, tapping against the bookstore's tall windows in a rhythm that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. She was shelving a stack of newly returned novels near the front, and I lingered nearby, pretending to organize the counter, but really just trying to keep track of her. How the dim light made her hair glint, how her fingers lingered on the spines as if memorizing each one. "I didn't realize it would rain tonight," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She paused, then added, "I should probably close soon." I nodded, but I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I stood closer than I probably should have, pretending to straighten books, but acutely aware of how small the space felt between us. Her scent was faint, comforting, and it made my chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and wrong. We worked in silence for a while, the only sound the occasional rustle of paper and the rain hitting the glass. Then she glanced up at me, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes held mine longer than they should. My heart jumped, and I realized she might have noticed how close I was standing. I wanted to say something, anything, to explain that I wasn't trying to invade her space, but the words stuck, heavy and useless in my throat. A sudden phone buzz broke the tension. She glanced at it, her expression tightening. "It's just someone checking in," she muttered, slipping the device back into her bag. I sensed the effort it took to mask the flicker of irritation, and I hated that I was rooting for her to be unguarded for me instead. Then, without warning, a loud knock at the door startled us both. One of her coworkers popped in to remind her she had an early delivery to prepare. She sighed, clearly irritated, and shot me a glance that said, without words, "This isn't the time." I wanted to reach out, to offer her comfort, maybe even a brush of fingers or a hesitant hand on her shoulder, but I froze. The tension between us, the storm outside, and the way her lips parted ever so slightly all made it feel like a confession was hanging in the air, but I didn't act. I didn't dare. As she turned to grab her bag, I noticed the small, human things, the faint line of fatigue under her eyes, the way she pressed her fingers together before moving, the hesitant tilt of her head. Every detail rooted me there, wanting, and yet painfully aware that stepping closer would cross a line we weren't ready to acknowledge. Her hand brushed mine briefly as she reached for the door, and I thought I might explode with everything I wasn't saying. She paused, just for the tiniest instant, our shoulders almost touching, and I swore I felt the world shrink around us. Then she pulled away. The moment vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with the hollow ache of what nearly was. I stayed rooted behind the counter, staring at the empty space she'd left, feeling the rain hammer against the windows like a reminder that some things, some confessions, some touches, couldn't yet happen. And still, my mind clung to that brief, forbidden proximity, replaying it over and over, wondering if she'd felt it too, and what might happen the next time we were alone. The bookstore was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows in thin, golden stripes. She was perched on a ladder, rearranging the top shelves, and I was stacking books nearby, pretending to be absorbed in the task. But I couldn't stop watching her. The way her hair fell across her face, the faint tension in her shoulders, the almost imperceptible bite of her lip when she concentrated. I cleared my throat, a small sound that seemed louder than it should. She glanced down at me, eyes lingering longer than usual, and I felt a strange, electric pull in the silence that had settled between us. "Why do we keep doing this?" I asked finally, my voice low, almost hesitant. "I mean, this pretending, acting like it's normal to be like this, standing here, close, but never really saying anything?" She froze mid-movement, one hand gripping the ladder for balance. Her eyes softened, but there was a guarded edge, the kind that said she had no intention of letting the question unravel her carefully controlled exterior. "I don't know," she whispered finally. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. Maybe because it's easier to pretend? I stepped a little closer, careful not to startle her. Easier? Or maybe we're scared. Scared of what it means if we don't pretend. My hands twitched at my sides. I wanted to reach for her, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Her gaze dropped to the floor for a long, painful beat. I noticed the subtle shift in her expression, the fatigue in her eyes, the tension that wasn't just from the work. I don't know what I want," she admitted, almost inaudible. "I know what I shouldn't want." And yet, her voice faltered, trailing off into the space between us. The silence stretched, heavy and full, each second amplifying the pull I felt in my chest. I wanted to ask more, to push her to speak, to name whatever it was that had been building between us since the first day I noticed her, the tension, the near touches, the shared looks. But the words felt too raw, too dangerous. We stood there, inches apart, not moving, not speaking, the air between us thick with unspoken admissions. My mind raced, imagining every possibility, every forbidden path we could take. But the truth, I realized, was that I was afraid. Afraid of losing this fragile balance. Afraid of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Finally, she took a deep breath, stepping down from the ladder, and our eyes met fully for the first time in what felt like hours. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, an honesty that made my chest ache. "I don't want to ruin what we have, even if I can't stop thinking about what we could be," she said, voice trembling slightly. The words hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came. I wanted to tell her everything, to reach for her, to admit that I felt the same impossible, complicated pull, but instead, I just nodded, and the silence swallowed us again. And then she added, almost to herself, almost to the empty room, "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." Her confession hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and intoxicating all at once, and I realized that in that quiet moment, everything had changed, and nothing could go back to normal. It was quiet that evening, the bookstore dimly lit, the last customers long gone. I was stacking the final shelf when she appeared at the doorway to the stockroom, holding a small envelope in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, the way they always did when she was about to share something she wasn't sure she wanted anyone to know. I found this today," she said, voice low, almost fragile. She held it out toward me, and I noticed the hesitation in her eyes, the way her shoulders curled inward like she was protecting herself. I took the envelope carefully, noticing the neat, familiar handwriting. My heart caught in my chest as I recognized it. Her handwriting, yes, but from years ago, when she'd sent letters she never intended to mail. My fingers brushed hers briefly, and I felt that familiar jolt, the one I'd been chasing without admitting it. I didn't know you kept these, I said softly. She shook her head, eyes glistening. I didn't. I didn't think anyone would ever see them. They're from when I lost him. Her voice cracked slightly, and I realized she was speaking of someone she loved and couldn't forget. The room seemed to shrink around us. I didn't know what to say. How could I? Her vulnerability, the faint quiver in her jaw, the exhaustion behind her eyes, all made me feel helpless and helplessly drawn in at once. You still think about him, I said carefully, more an observation than a question. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears. She looked down at the floor, taking a slow, shuddering breath. Every day, she admitted. I try not to, but sometimes it's like he's still here, reminding me of everything I lost, everything I can't fix. I swallowed hard, my own chest tightening. I know, I said quietly, though I didn't. I couldn't possibly know fully, but I could see the weight it had placed on her. The guarded smiles, the careful distance, the moments of hesitation that had kept me on edge since the first day. She handed me the letter, and I hesitated, feeling the enormity of the trust she was giving me. Every word I read was raw, intimate, a fragment of a life she had tried to lock away. And in that silence, I felt the tension between us shift, less charged with unspoken desire, more layered with the delicate gravity of shared pain. I've never shown anyone, she whispered, her hand brushing against mine, accidental but deliberate enough to make me notice. I didn't think I could until now. I didn't respond immediately. I just let my eyes linger on hers, noticing the faint glimmer of hope buried beneath the sadness, the small tremor of fear she tried to hide. And in that suspended moment, the world outside seemed irrelevant. Finally, she stepped back slightly, giving me space, but the air between us was heavier, charged in a different way now. Intimate, devastating, real. I don't know what happens next, she said softly, almost as if afraid to finish the sentence. I didn't answer, because I couldn't, but I didn't need to. That small pause, that trembling confession, and the brush of her hand against mine said more than any words could. And in that quiet, seismic moment, I realized nothing would ever feel normal again. The bookstore smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, a mix that had become comforting over the weeks I'd spent here with her. She was perched on the edge of the counter, legs swinging slightly, staring out at the rain-slicked street. I didn't speak at first, just leaned against the opposite counter, letting the quiet stretch between us. You know, she said finally, voice soft, almost hesitant. I've spent so long pretending that none of this matters, that it's just moments, nothing more. Her fingers traced the edge of the counter absently. But it does. It always has. I felt the familiar pull in my chest, that mixture of relief and terror. I wanted to reach out, to say something clever or bold, but the words felt too loud, too sudden. So I moved a fraction closer, letting the space between us shrink naturally, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes flicked to mine for a second, then away, down at her hands. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the same one I'd seen before when she was letting herself be vulnerable. My own hand itched to brush against hers, but I waited. I let her set the pace, as she always did. You don't have to say anything, she murmured, almost to herself. Just stay. I nodded, slowly, silently. It was enough. Just being here, in this small, shared space, felt like an admission bigger than any words I could manage. I moved a little closer still, enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and she didn't pull away. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows, but inside, there was only the quiet between us. I noticed the faint tilt of her head toward me, the way her fingers brushed the counter in rhythm with the rain, and I realized that the distance we'd maintained all this time had collapsed on its own. Without thinking, I reached out and let my hand brush hers, slow, deliberate, almost shy. She didn't pull away. Her fingers twined with mine naturally, a simple, human gesture that said everything we hadn't dared to speak. The warmth of her touch made the air feel heavier, richer, and I felt a quiet, unspoken promise settle between us. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Just sitting there, hands linked, shoulders almost touching, felt more honest than any confession I could have made. There was no rush, no dramatic declaration, just understanding, acceptance, and the kind of intimacy that comes from having seen someone's fragility and choosing to stay anyway. After a while, she leaned her head slightly toward mine, brushing her hair against my shoulder. It was a small movement, almost accidental, but it sealed everything for me. I let my forehead rest lightly against hers, closing my eyes for a moment, savoring the simplicity of this quiet collapse into something inevitable. And then, without a word, we stayed like that, hands intertwined, breath slow and synchronized, the storm outside fading into a soft patter. It was enough. It was everything. In that shared silence, in the gentle warmth of her presence, I realized that this was the point we'd been moving toward all along. No grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just the quiet certainty that we belonged here, together, finally allowed to be real. It's quiet now, late evening, and I'm sitting at the counter of the bookstore, the same place where everything began. The rain has stopped, leaving a faint scent of wet pavement in the air. She's on the ladder again, rearranging a few books near the top shelf, and I watch her with a sense of calm I didn't have before, like the storm we weathered together has finally passed. I think about the months leading up to this moment, the awkward pauses, the stolen glances, the tiny gestures that carried more weight than I ever imagined. I remember how I used to be so hesitant, afraid of crossing some invisible line, and how she, in turn, guarded herself carefully, keeping the past close and the present at arm's length. But something shifted between us, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and now, sitting here, I can see how it changed everything. She's different, too, softer in some ways, not in weakness, but in willingness. She lets herself be seen, lets herself rest, lets me in. And in that, I've learned that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about noticing the small things, the brush of a hand, a fleeting smile, the quiet understanding that words can't capture. I glance at her as she stretches to reach a book on the top shelf. The sunlight catches her hair, and for a moment I'm struck by the thought that maybe, just maybe, this is what it feels like when something real finally lands where it belongs. Not perfect, not dramatic, but honest. I lean back slightly, letting the quiet wash over us. There's laughter now, small jokes that weren't possible before, and a warmth in the air that fills the corners of the bookstore, the spaces between shelves, and even the spaces between us. We move around each other with ease now, a shared rhythm that wasn't there before, built from months of tension, hesitation, and tentative steps toward understanding. I realize how much I've changed. I'm more patient, more present, more aware of the fragile beauty in everyday moments. And I see how she's changed too, not in ways that erase her past, but in ways that allow the past to exist without dominating the present. Sometimes I catch myself replaying the moments that led us here, the ones where we almost fell, almost faltered, almost lost the courage to keep going. And I understand now that those near misses were part of the story, the subtle shaping of what we have today. I reach for a cup of coffee she made earlier, the steam curling into the golden light, and I think about the quiet, ordinary joy of simply being near her. No fireworks, no declarations, just presence, warmth, and the kind of peace that comes from finally being able to exhale. And in that quiet afterglow, I know we've both learned something essential. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently in small moments, in shared silences, in the simple act of staying. I smile to myself, glancing at her as she arranges a final stack of novels, and whisper under my breath, This feels exactly right. And maybe that's the thing I'd want anyone reading to remember. Sometimes love doesn't need to be spoken loudly. Sometimes it's enough to just be here, together, quietly, and let the world catch up. What small moments in your life have quietly shaped your heart?